All right. And I think we are live. Welcome to QuaranCon and our panel on short stories. Before we start, I'd like to say thank you to everybody for all the work they've done on putting QuaranCon together, and to remind people who are watching to visit Artists Alley on the website. So if you go into the QuaranCon website, you can see up at the top tabs Artists Alley, or you can put it straight in Artists-Alley. Now, our short story panel today, we're really lucky to be joined by some incredible short story authors. And the theme that we have to go through today, our brief, is to look at the fact that a story is a journey, and some are epics told over years, whereas others may capture a single moment in time. What a writer conveys is more important than the word count, and a short story can be an intense experience, leaving you thinking for days. And the brief we have to discuss, therefore, also involves how writing a short story differs from a novel. I'm E Hannaford, and I'm your moderator for today, and I'm going to introduce the panel that we've got here. I'm going to go through you in alphabetical order. So, Karen, if you'd like to introduce yourself, please, a little bit about your work.
My name is Karen Diem, and I write the ARCA series, which is superhero urban fantasy. I have quite a few short stories in that same universe, and then a couple random other things that completely seem unconnected, but I really wanted to write.
Okay. And if we go to Patrick.
Hi, Patrick LeClerc. I've written kind of all over the map. I have a urban fantasy immortal story that I've got two novels in that, and I've written a couple short stories that tie in with that. I've also done a sword and sorcery kind of swashbuckly, kind of pulp themed series, some swashbuckling buddy rogues. I've written a military science fiction, which doesn't seem like close to anything. And now, just probably because it would make sense to continue either of those series, I've decided to depart completely and do a Victorian steampunk thing for my next thing that I'm working on, just because the voices in my head want me to write what they want me to write.
And we have to listen to those voices.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Joyce.
Hi, I'm Joyce Reynolds-Ward. I have 3 series. One, the Netwalk sequence, is going to be have new covers, some edits, and be re-released this fall. It's been 10 years. I have a fantasy series, and then I have the current near future science fiction, corporate soap opera, agri-punk, you name it, with biobots. I tend to use short story. I've also have a number of short stories published recently, most recently. My man left me, my dog hates me, and there goes my truck in Black Eyed Peas and New Year's Day, which is out from Bookview Cafe. I'm a Writers of the Future semi-finalist and honorable mention. And these days I tend to really focus on writing short stories tied into my series because they help me develop the characters.
Brilliant. And Clayton.
I'm Clayton Snyder. I've written a whole mess of standalones, really. Most of my stuff falls kind of between fantasy and horror. Even the funnier stuff tends to fall that way. A few of my titles are A River of Thieves, The Obsidian Psalm, Demons Inc., which is urban fantasy noir. So I've kind of got my hands in a lot of pots as far as that goes, and short stories are kind of my pressure valve, I guess is a better way to put it. They're palate cleansers for me to do something that's not a novel. So,
And that's a good way to lead in. Say, if we're looking at these short stories, so what is it about these short stories? You say that they're a palate cleanser for you. So what is it you enjoy about writing one of those compared to novels?
I like the fact that you can take basically a vignette from any point in time or any world and just build it complete. You know, and if you're careful with it, you can put in all the emotion, all the fear, all the you know, wonder, any of those things that go along with a novel. You can put that in there along with the character and still have the same impact, just in a shorter form. And that's what I really love about them, is that they're this bite-sized just bit of fun, for lack of a better word. They're for me, they're very fun to write. Being able to just kind of toss all these ingredients in, and I'm not held to this genre or that. I can make it what I want, and not really expect it to not expect the market to backlash against it, I guess.
Okay. Karen, so what is it about short stories that does it for you? What is it you enjoy about them?
I'm sorry.
Well, let's start out first with a nice delaying noise, and then I can move into frantically trying to come up with an answer, because of course I didn't prepare. What I like is I like the chance to reveal the little scenes and moments that maybe don't fit into the novel as a whole, but they're just fun, or they're a way to explore a little bit. Again, stuff that may not have fit into the main novel because you don't really pause from, say, the big fight to do it. Most people don't pause. I'm certain there's an author somewhere who has, because we're nothing if not inconsistent with each other. You don't usually pause from like the big action scene to go back and think about your relationship with your parents and that time where the dog ended up with the polka dots and you accidentally gave your brother the mohawk. But that might be a fun story to tell, you know, and that's what I like the shorts for, is, you know, here's all these little moments, here's all these little things that are just fun to know about. It's the anecdotes of character lives, is what I think of them. Anyway.
I've noticed that with your kind of list of the order of sequence, that you do have a lot of these conjoining short stories between different books in the series. So that makes perfect sense.
Yes. I actually have one washout, which is between two chapters of my first book, because it was like, well, this is really cool, but this really would just bog things down if I put it in. So let's pull it out, and we'll give it to my newsletter folks, because they're awesome people who should continue reading my newsletters.
We'll come back to that one afterwards, I think, the newsletter link. Patrick, what is it for you that you enjoy about them?
There's a couple different things. Some ideas just really lend themselves to a short. You can take a pretty simple idea, a pretty quirky idea, and kind of run with it. And maybe it's something that would be hard to develop into 75,000 words, but sometimes it's the short story is exactly the right space to get your point across. And if you're making a quick point, sometimes it's best in a short story. You go in and you get done what you need to get done. The other side of my short stories is I really miss the old pulp fantasy, like the Robert E. Howard stuff, the Edgar Rice Burroughs stuff. And a lot of those were originally short stories. They're originally short stories in magazines before, like Fritz Lieber's Fafhrd and the Great Mouser. They've been combined into books now, and that's how you buy them, but they were originally magazine shorts. And so when I write my pulp, I kind of fall into a short story format almost, and it kind of feels the right length. It's enough space to get the plot in, get what I need done. So some of it's just let the medium suit the subject, I guess.
Yeah. Joyce, and then I'll open the next one up to all of you to attack at the same time, should you wish.
Well, I mean, I have two different sets of stories. I mean, the first set are stories that are definitely one-offs. They're short stories. And sometimes it's just a little trigger. There's one called So Sorry About Your Loss, which got me a really ugly rejection from a big editor. And it was just kicked off by one of my colleagues. We were all middle school teachers. We were in the faculty room, and it was like springtime, and there was like Administrative Professionals Day or something like that. She was going, there's a greeting card for every occasion. And that kind of kicked that story off. So that's kind of the one that's in Black Eyed Peas is kind of one of those. It's a takeoff on a meme I saw on Facebook. But the stories that tie into my book series, sometimes I'm just exploring an aspect of a character, or it's a little bit in the backstory that it doesn't fit in the books, or I'm trying to understand something, a motivation, or why something happened. And right now I'm kind of working on the 3 final books of the series, and those books are basically going to be short stories, although one is only designated as a short story collection. So yeah, but that's my thing. The short is really a distilled novel. I took a class with James Gunn online years ago, and that's basically what he said is, you pair off everything extraneous and focus in.
Okay, that's good. I like that. So opened up to all of you then. You all write novels, obviously, in addition to short stories. No one is exclusively short story writer. So how do you feel your creation process itself differs for a short story compared to a novel? I mean, I hear a lot about people talking about beats and things like this when they're forming a novel. Not everybody plans, obviously. There's lots of pantsers in the world. I definitely fall into the plantser. Or plantser, however you pronounce it. Plan bits and pants others. Whatever I plan goes completely awry when the characters go their own way. But how does it differ for you when you're creating a short story compared to a full novel?
I'll jump in. I think for one thing, I tend to be my novels I tend to be a plotter when it comes to novels. I tend to be more rigid. The short story is, I might sketch out some thoughts before I start writing, and I might have a sense of what my scenes are, but the process takes longer. I'm one of these people that will write 2,000 to 5,000 words a day when I'm writing a novel, but a short story will take me a week. And part of it is that I am going through and I am looking at the word choices and, and editing and thinking really hard. Do I need this? I don't need a first chapter of another book. And so for me, the process takes longer for a short story because it has to be that distilled and thoughtful and self-contained.
Okay. Anyone else want to offer on that?
Yeah, I think Patrick and Joyce really hit on it with the last question. For me, anyways, 2 things that really mark out what makes me decide to write a short story are, is it enough of an idea for a book, which generally is easy to tell these days, where it's going to be and how the shape of it. The other thing is intensity. I tend to play with emotion a lot in my short stories, and when I write, or when I sit down to write one, I'm generally looking at evoking an emotion in the reader, and I want that to be as intense as possible. And it's not always achievable in a novel because you have to stretch it out. There's all this tension. There's pacing and all that. And within a short story, you can really just run up to somebody and clobber them in the jaw. That's my goal. So
That's good. I like that. To really try and pull them in and rip their hearts out.
right. So
Patrick or Karen?
I mean, I think that with the novel, it feels a little freer. I can be a lot less disciplined. I'm very much a pantser, so I'll start writing and I can wander off on tangents and I can write a bunch of disjointed scenes that I know are going to have to be there eventually. And the story kind of fills itself in, but I have room to plan. I have room to do it. I have room to experiment. With a short story, I tend to be a lot more focused. I kind of have an idea of what I want to accomplish. And if it's going to be a short and I have a specific point I'm trying to make or a specific thing I want to explore, I'm much more focused. I'm much more disciplined. I actually write faster when I do that. Of course, there's always the danger that a short story turns into chapter 1. I think Joyce mentioned that. That's happened to me before. I think it's happened to everybody. But generally, it's a different mindset that I attack a short story with.
Do you find that quite often, that you'll create a short story, you'll do this short, powerful piece, and then you'll go away, and a few months later, it's still sitting there, and you're like, actually, that's something else. That's got to be bigger. That there's room.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. River of Thieves started out as a short and it ended up as a full novel by the time I was done. So.
Pledges of Honor, my CISBO semifinalist, started out as a short story. And I got this rejection saying, this is the first chapter. I looked at it, scratched my chin. I went, she's right.
What about you, Karen?
Well, for me, I'm a very disorganized planner, you could say, because with a novel, I have to sit down and I have to draw up my outline, which has all the major parts of it. I mean, they could be beats or something. I don't know, because I don't really break it down like that. To me, it's like, okay, here's the story. I'm going to just say what the main things of the story are and then fill it in as I go along. And then inevitably, as I'm filling it in, I find out, well, I didn't quite get to where I thought the middle bit was because I'm over here. So I'm just going to, redo my whole outline, pretend that's what it was supposed to be in the first place, and keep writing from there. With the short stories, I don't usually outline. Like Patrick mentioned, I have an idea. And I know roughly where it's going to go, so I don't do as much of the trying to organize it and make certain that the story makes coherent sense to anyone else, because it's short enough where I can hold it in my brain, I guess.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's faster, even though generally I'm not trying as a rule to convey any deep thoughts or make people think. I mean, I'm not trying to write Those Who Walk Away from Omelas or anything like that. I'm trying to write comfort food. I want to write something fun. I want to write something people will enjoy. And I think it's awesome that people can write the other stuff. That's just not my thing. And with the shorts, like I said, I know where I'm going roughly, and generally I can write them fast enough before they go off the rails too badly. As far as them being first chapters, I haven't had that quite happen yet. I had a few chapters I pulled from one book end up being my longest book yet, the next one in the series. I do, however, have a closed room space opera mystery, which I'm feeling kind of like might be a prologue story to a whole series. But I'm not allowing myself to write any books other than the the series, the Arca World series right now until I have completed the Arca World series because I'm being focused, sort of.
It's easy to get sidetracked, isn't it? We've got a question. I'm looking to the right because I've actually got my YouTube open on the right down here. And we've got a question that actually ties in here from Jessica Halsey saying, do you write short stories in one sitting then, or do the ideas develop over a longer period of time? So obviously that sort of ties a little bit into what we're talking about there, I think.
It depends on the type of short story, I think. Something where I get an idea and I kind of know where I'm going with it. Like a Train in Vain, I wrote basically in one sitting, and then I had to revise it and edit it and clean it up. But it pretty much came to me. I knew what I wanted to play with, and I did it basically in one swell swoop. But there's a number of times that I've had to drag one out over a couple weeks as ideas came in and I played with it. It depends more if it's. I guess it just depends on what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. Is that the same for the rest of you? I mean, Clayton, you were incredibly fast with a short story I know of.
Yeah, generally 1 to 2 days for me. If it takes longer than that, it's either going to turn into something much bigger than I had planned for, or I've messed something up. And as far as my process goes,
I'm generally not an all at once, simply because my writing time is very fragmented, especially with the pandemic. So I try to get in as much as I can before I have to stop writing. And then the next day I read over what I had before and continue on from there. And I just kind of think about it during my non-writing times until whenever it's done.
Yeah, I'm not an all at once. I've been trying to think, do I have anything that really came out all at once, even with my shorter fiction, which I tend to write the longer short stories, 5,000 words. But my process, I think, just tends to be that I really, if I'm doing it fast, it's about 2 to 3 days. But I don't think I've ever really sat down and written a short story in one sitting.
You know, the odd thing about that is typically when I drop a short story within a day, 6 to 8 hours, those are the ones that sell. It's never the ones that I actually take the time and spend a week on or 2 weeks. Something I'll sit down, write, and yeah, in a few hours, that's the one people pick up, and it has always baffled me. So,
I mean, I can do that with
just on.
I can do that with an essay. I can knock off an essay in a morning, but short stories,
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to be a technical writer of all things, and I would write, I would say 10 to 15,000 words a day, assuming that I could test that fast and make sure that my stuff fit. So, I mean, straight nonfiction like that, it's a lot faster for me.
Okay, I think we've kind of sort of touched on the third question. But I think I'll ask it in full in case any of you feel like you could add to it. In the sense that, do you base stories in established worlds, or do you create new ones? And this can be your own worlds, this can be shared worlds. If you're creating a new one, how do you deal with establishing that feel of a world so quickly so that you immerse the reader into it with this more restricted word count? Patrick?
I've only written shorts in established worlds, and sometimes they're our world, and sometimes it's the world that's in one of the other books. But I think it's definitely challenging to do a lot of world building in a short. Like I said, unless it's a much longer short. Again, if you're into the 6,000 words, maybe you can build a little world, but you're still doing a lot of shorthand. You're still kind of a riff on worlds people have seen before. Like I did a short that was I had a few that I termed my misunderstood minions. I had a stormtrooper's letter home to mom that I wrote, from the Death Star. And I had the Forgotten Orc High, some old one surviving veterans of the Orc side of Helm's Deep. Now he's an old veteran. He's Cajun drinks at a bar from the young kids and tell them stories. So that kind of thing. Everybody knows the world, or the vast majority of people are familiar with it. So I could play with it, and I didn't have to explain anything. I've also done stuff that happens in our world, maybe with a little supernatural twist in it, but it's still largely recognizable.
Okay. Clayton?
Oh, I'm pretty lazy when it comes to that. I sketch out, especially if it's fantasy, I will sketch out things that are, I guess as Patrick said, recognizable from other fantasy tropes. And then I kind of just match them together so you get a feel for the world without having too much detail, because typically when I write a short, it's about character and it's about emotion, and the other stuff is just set dressing. So
that's a good way of looking at it, I think. And enough to put you in the place, enough to give you a feel. And as you say, established worlds, there are so many typical worlds that putting a short into one of those with established rules, I suppose, makes that a little easier if you chose to.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever really done like anything within an established property so much as borrowed elements. So, a giant sea of grass, stone ruins that are recall, mine imagery, that sort of thing. Things that are somewhat recognizable to us that we can go, oh, okay, and then just move on and get to the heart of the story.
Okay. Yeah, that works. Joyce?
A lot of times my standalone short stories are based on a mood or an image. And like one that is, I've got it now up as an individual on Amazon, is Slow Dancing in 3/4 Zombie Time. And it really, the zombies, you never see them. They're just out there. And it's really a story of survival and parental love. And it was more of a mood piece. And that's what I find with a lot of my short work. At the time I was hanging out and writing around with Jay Lake, who is no longer with us, alas. And Jay tended toward that type of mood piece and just like throwing off the world building, and coming up with some pretty amazing stuff. And so that kind of rubbed off a little bit. But my so my standalones, there's usually like, I have to have the mood, and the mood that affects how the setting comes out in the world building. And so that's the image or the mood is what I'm really trying to capture in a short story, more so than a novel, because in the novel, it's the characters and telling the story. But I'm trying to convey mood and emotion in a short. And so even the stuff that, and then the things that are tied into my series, they're also still, there's a quest for a mood, a quest for a setting. And I go from there.
Okay. Karen?
Oh boy. Mine are generally set in my Arca World universe. So I am working from a framework that people who are reading the stories are theoretically familiar with. And even if they aren't, because it's superhero urban fantasy, it's close enough to our world that a lot of the stuff I reference, I can just reference. Like if I say someone's in a national park, I don't have to go to a ton of extremes describing how it's supported by the government and blah, blah, blah. Stuff nobody really cares about when they've got this story and they want to know if the woman's going to blow up her parents or whatever. With the short stories, I do a bit less describing of the setting. In that case, I'm following Clayton's lead a little bit and using it as stage dressing to convey an idea or even a mood. Like if I say that this spaceship has like ratty carpet, but the guest chairs are like gold satin with little red sparkly tassels, and there's the faint lingering perfume of the previous owners of the ship who departed in haste. You know, it sets a completely different mood if I'm talking about the smooth lines of plastic chairs and the corrugated metal decks.
Yeah, I can see how that.
But I think that one of the nice things about writing in your own world or using some kind of reference, like a concept of a guy in a field of grass, is you can use it to tie things together for the reader. You can give them that little shortcut to, okay, I know what the scene is. Now I can move into what's going on in it.
Yeah. So considering that, one of the questions that we've got quite a lot of questions appearing actually in YouTube, if you guys can see them as well. I'll fish them out in a moment, but we have got
That's
quite
because
a few
we're all
appearing.
fascinating.
You are. One that's just come to me. It's not one of the ones I originally pre-warned you on, but something that kind of, from what you're saying, how important do you feel that your choice of title can be when it comes to a short story? Joyce, you're nodding.
I think it's even more important with a short story than it is for a novel. And I've been in part of a number of anthologies and gone, had long discussions with the editors, often one of my friends, but discussions about, is this really the right title for a short story? And it's not as difficult to do novel titles, but boy, that short story title is part of your package.
I'd agree. I think if you get an anthology, quite often that temptation to just look down the titles, isn't it, and decide which title catches your eye.
Mm-hmm.
Clayton?
I am awful at titling things. I typically don't know. I mean, I have an idea. Maybe it's the feeling of the short. Maybe it's just the name of the character, and it's usually one word for me. But I'm just really quite bad at it. So
It's not my favorite bit either. Patrick?
Titles are tough. I think titles are definitely one of the harder things to do.
Yeah.
Because you want. So I think the harder thing for an author, once we've created something, the more you want us to distill it down, the harder it is. We all hate synopses. We all really hate elevator pitches. The title is even worse than that. You've got a phrase and you have to convey enough about your story that somebody's going to want to read it. Sometimes you luck out and they're obvious, and a lot of times they're really not, and they've been a struggle. So
yeah. Okay. I'm going to come back to the last one of the ones I gave you. There are Crystal, I've noticed, is now saying, Clayton, you are excellent at titling things. She's in complete disagreement with you there. Okay. How do short stories support your writing of your longer works? Do you feel they support them, and how do they support them? I'll let you guys go at it.
Okay.
Okay.
I think that it does let you take aspects of a story sometimes and develop them and play with them a little bit more. Something that may be just tangential to the plot of a novel. So sometimes that gives you a little background.
Yeah.
It lets you work out, some of your flex your creative muscles in a way that not necessarily would tie into a novel per se, but any writing is good writing. Any writing is going to get you moving, and it lets you play with ideas that you may not otherwise play with. And again, there's always that seed. There's always that fact that short story can turn into chapter 1 of the next great novel. So I think it's just it's improvisation. I think everybody should do a little bit of it, even if you have a dedicated series that you write in. Play with other things, just because it broadens your skill set, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that when I was writing, I've been in and out of the writing world. I started writing in the 90s, dropped out for a while, and then came back. And back then, the reflected wisdom was that in order to promote yourself as a novel writer, you needed to write and sell short stories. And so I did that. I was a parent. And then later on, when I was teaching, I had a lot of things pulling for my attention. But the thing is that if you're a dedicated short story writer, the usual thing used to be you need to have 20 short stories in circulation. Well, if you think about the word count and the amount of writing that goes into constantly keeping 20 short stories on the market, that's equivalent to a novel, except that you're resolving a whole arc in it. And so like Patrick said, it builds your skill set. It allows you to work. And again, it allows you to play with things that you might not want to techniques that you might not want to carry out at novel length, because you're still learning. I mean, even after writing for a number of years, you're always going to be playing with skill sets. And it's a lot easier to experiment with a new technique in a short story than a novel.
Yeah. Karen?
I think that particular bit of advice they used to give writers about having a lot of short stories in order to sell your novels is kind of funny, because in some ways there are very different skills involved. You have to be able to pull it in and encapsulate things into a short story to communicate whatever your short story is about. And then in a novel, you need to be able to sustain something much more prolonged. I mean, I have known writers who are amazing short story writers. They're just pumping out those short stories, and you're like, holy crap, I'm in awe. It took me 3 weeks to finish writing my story with my schedule, but you did this one in like 5 hours, and you're doing another one now before dinner because, you felt like it. And I've read these stories and they're wonderful. And then there's also those authors where you're like, yeah, that's a short story. Can you go back to your novel, please? Because I loved your novels. But maybe you're experimenting a little too much with this short story here. But I do think that's an interesting thing, telling people that they had to have a lot of short stories in order to write a novel. I don't think it's really true, at least not anymore. And I've completely gotten off topic, haven't I? Sorry.
It's my fault. I got us started.
Looking at the time, I'm just looking at the questions. We've got a few others here, and two of them kind of match together quite well. Ponderings of Pete, do you have any pieces of advice for writing connected short stories, like a book of short stories with common themes, worlds, or semi-related storyline? And kind of almost following on from that, we've then got P.S. Livingston. Pam, if you did serialized short stories, would you still consider them to be short stories? Or would you then consider them that if they're connected, would that be, how connected would they be before it was no longer short stories?
I think it depends on the connection. Are they following the same character through the same setting, through the same storyline? Then obviously what you've got are chapters and not necessarily short stories. No, if it's just a shared world and the characters change and the circumstances change and everything is slightly different, but there are core elements, then that would be a chain together system, and that's your That's your follow-on short story, the serialization. So it just kind of depends on your approach.
I
You
mean,
know,
Spinrack was one I saw this year, the Duppy Capybara Pirate, which was very much a selection of short stories in a sequence in a world that told a story, but each was very much in its own time capsule, even though it had the same characters. And I know that got nominated for a few awards earlier in the year. That was quite an interesting concept with the collection of all these shorts, but they were very distinctly shorts, I felt, as much as they were chapters, kind of almost equal and balanced. It was quite a strange mix in that respect.
It depends how much of could it stand alone. Like if you read it as a standalone, would it make sense? And I think if you can read it as a standalone and it makes sense, then I think it can serve as a short story. And like I said, with that's kind of what I did with my Broken Crossroads, which is very inspired by the Lieber and Howard and all those pulps, because they were individually written as short stories, but you can't buy a Conan short story today. You can buy a book where they're set out in a sequence, and this happens clearly before that, but they all have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You could pull any one of them out and read it independently, and it would make sense. I think if it can stand alone, it's a short story, even if it's a linked series of short stories. It's like watching an episode of Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to watch them in order. It doesn't need to be a through line, but they're all same characters, same universe, and there's a vague through line. So it all kind of depends. It's a very...
I'd also argue that depends on which Star Trek, but that's a different conversation.
Well, and then I think of two examples. First of all, Isaac Asimov's I, Robot stories, which are definitely a collection of individual stories with the same characters and repeating themes. The other one, which interestingly uses a framing format, are the Zena Henderson People stories. And those are, again, they stand alone. You can read them individually, but you can also read them as as advancing a sequential plot. I've kind of been playing with this with the Martini Air Legacy books because, well, these three are like, they're a trilogy. But the one I recently released and the one I'm working on now is a standalone novel, but they both cover like a 30-year period. Well, you're not going to write everything in 30 years. A sequential thing, it's boring. But I'm also working on some short stories set in that world with a unifying theme, but different points of view. And I think that's a big factor right there, is how you frame it, how you set it, and just how it all falls together.
As far as the question about connecting them, I think a shared setting is an easy way to connect them, especially if it's all yours, or you're dealing with an intellectual property and have the appropriate contracts in place, not a lawyer, blah, blah, blah. Other than that, I think it depends on why you're writing them. If your theme is what's most important about your short stories, if your mood is what's most important, then I would say make that your unifying factor in your shorts. If your unifying factor is the adventures of the hero from a series, then concentrate on that. As far as serials go, I don't know about all other genres. I would say that serials are more like Netflix shows where they expect you to binge watch them in order to get to the complete tail end. They don't necessarily have the tidy little tied up at the end of the series, or pardon me, end of the episode ending. Again, this is more superhero stuff because that's what I'm familiar with.
Yeah, that's
but that
good.
would also differentiate them from the short stories because, like Patrick and I think Joyce agreed, generally short stories have an ending. You know, they have their own internal structure. They have an ending. They conclude the primary issue of the episode or story or what have you. And in a serial, you don't necessarily have that, or you have some really big overarching thing that's being pushed forward, in which case it's a slightly different version of a novel.
I'd agree. I think that's a good definition when we're looking at the serial of things moving through. I'm going to move to another question on this one. How did you get started on your choices of novels or short stories, and would you have done it in reverse in hindsight? Have any of you started on one and moved into the other, or vice versa?
Yeah, I actually started with short stories, and I wrote, oh Lord, probably around 100 of them before I even started to write a novel. And I part of that is my own fault. I always thought that that's how it was supposed to be done. Excuse me. I grew up reading Stephen King, Clive Barker, and just a whole slew of short story writers, and that's the impression that I had at the time, was that you had to turn out these short stories, you had to learn the craft, and then you could move on into the longer form stuff. If I could do it different now, yeah, I'd probably try a novel earlier so I would be better at it now. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that there's very much, as you say, that as several of you have said, this idea that you had to do short stories first is very much out there. And yet, if you look at a lot of trad agents looking for trad publishing, a lot of them will actually turn around and make a statement of saying that writing a short story, as some of you, as you've mentioned, is a different skill set to writing a novel. And therefore, they don't necessarily look at someone who's successful at short story writing and saying they can write a novel. Would you say that was a fair assumption, or do you think they're missing talent there?
There's overlapping skills, I will say.
Sorry.
That's all right, Clayton, go on. I think you started there first.
Karen's right though. It's definitely. I mean, there's a little bit of an overlap, but there is definitely a gap in the skill sets. Learning how to pace, learning how to build tension. All those things are much different in short form than they are in novel form, I think.
Yeah. Anyone else? No.
Go ahead, Karen.
No, I started with short stories. In the early days of the internet, I was involved with a short story e-zine, Quantum Muse, that we actually accepted short stories from people, curated them, published them, and I did a lot of short story reading and writing with that. And it is a different, again, it's different, but it's an overlapping skill set, because you don't get the amount of plan. It was a learning curve when I started writing longer pieces. So it can go that way. I don't know anybody who started out specifically writing novels. I've never heard anybody say that. I'm sure somebody has, but it just
there will be somebody out there somewhere.
Technically,
I started out doing both, and it was kind of like I would be working on the novel, and short story idea would come, so I'd put it aside, work on the short story, send it out, go back to work on the novel. And so I was always kind of juggling the two early on. I can't do that these days. It's really hard for me to back off from a novel and do a short story.
I have to admit, if I get stuck sometimes on something bigger and a short comes along and waves its fancy leg at me, I go, yeah, I'll have a bit of you. And it will, off I'll go and out it will come, and then, yeah. So they are quite often a palate cleanser there as well. But okay. On that bit of short, Andrew Webb, how short is a short story? And when do you decide it should become longer? How short do you consider comes into the short story? I mean, we know this flash fiction is very short. Obviously, there are formal definitions, but what would you consider would count as a short story in your sort of range?
I think for me, a short is typically between 2,000 and 4,000 words. That's my comfort zone. For other people, it's, closer to 8 to 10. It just depends on where you're at. I tend to write to market when I write, or at least aim to write to market. So I'm looking at that submission guidelines and all that, and I've kind of been stuck in that ever since. So I average out at about 3,000 words short. Anything smaller than that, I'd say anything smaller than 2,000 is closer to flash, or definitely a short. So
Yeah, we have a consensus on that. Much nodding.
I actually think a short story can be quite a bit longer. I normally, there's a series of definitions floating around the internet somewhere where they're like, this is what makes a novella. Anything over 45,000 words is a novel. But I pretty much think it's a short story up to about 15,000 words. Naturally, if I'm writing a short story and it's not for an anthology where they have given me a word count that I must stick to, mine end up in the 10 to 12 range pretty reliably. Maybe I just have that much to say about whatever it is and can't bear to kill my darlings enough, but I'd agree on the flash fiction definition, though.
Yeah, it's definitely that much shorter end. The panel question that we originally started with mentions that we often reflect on stories after we finish. So with shorts, it's often more open-ended. So do you feel that that's something that you would aim to produce, that afterthought, leaving the reader thinking about it later and later? And do you think it's more acceptable for a short to be more open-ended?
Yeah, as I kind of mentioned, I grew up reading Stephen King and Clive Barker, and there are so many of their shorts that just kind of end with a beat like that, and that's it. That's the end. And some of those shorts are incredibly haunting. They stick with you, and it's the same with even older classics. I believe it's, and I know I'm going to get this wrong, Incident at Owl Creek Bridge, The Yellow Wallpaper, The Lottery, all these kind of shorts have this impact at the end, and at least the best ones do, and they leave you thinking about it for maybe hours or days later. And that's kind of what I aim for when I write, but it's not always an attainable goal. You get as close as you can.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times when I think about some of the shorts, I'll think about, Jack London's classic To Build a Fire. Some of John Steinbeck's short work can be incredibly haunting. And he was another one that would write to a theme and a setting. And like The Long Valley is one collection of his shorts, which are Pastures of Heaven. And he openly said, it's about the effect that, it was a very peaceful place. And then this one family moved in and things just started spiraling with people.
Yeah.
I will say that, again, I might be taking a contrary view here. I like my stories to have endings. Whether I am speaking as an incredibly voracious reader who might have a problem, or an author, I don't really like it if they don't resolve. I don't really want to be haunted by someone else's horrible thoughts. I've got enough of my own. And I mean, there are some beautiful short stories out there where I totally admire the skill that went into making these stories. But I really wish that they would have, written about hope instead of despair, or something where it's not going to be depressing to think about the story. I want to read the story. I want to enjoy it. If I leave a story, I want to leave it with a feeling of, yes, I like that ending. And I feel like despite all of the stuff that was happening, despite the beatdown that Batman took or whatever, at the end he got back up again, and he beat the bad guy, or at least resolved whatever the issue was. Again, like I said, there's nothing wrong with those. It's not my taste. But I felt like I needed to speak up.
You like that closure in yours?
I like what?
You like that closure then?
Yeah. I like that closure, yes. I have enough stuff floating around in my head that's all my fault already, from the shiny squirrel stories that I probably shouldn't get distracted and write, to my own depressing thoughts and ponderings on certain things. I don't really want to have somebody else's lingering and be like, well, gosh darn it, I just want to know that my favorite character survived, or so-and-so got her man, or, whether or not that woman ever got off the cliff's edge that she was dangling from.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I know, Patrick, you mentioned Train in Vain earlier. That's another one that has definitely got an ending that leaves you walking away and thinking.
Yeah. Well, again, that was, it's not, the point of that wasn't necessarily just to tell the story. The point was to engage in that kind of, is this, the right and wrong of that kind of manipulation.
Yeah. And the concept of a story about being manipulated by a goddess, basically, the way I read it anyway. Yes. And how they'd manipulated significant figures through time. You're left with just that hint that maybe this was an ongoing thing. And I quite like, and like Karen, I like that thought. And I find quite often that because we have closure in novels, they don't necessarily, sometimes they'll leave sitting in your head for months, but sometimes you do get more of that strength of feeling from a short because it's unresolved.
Yeah.
And so if we look at some of the others, what have we got? We still have any ones there? So if we think about those, I mean, I'm one of the ones that N.K. Jemisin's New Skin, Emergency Skin, was one for me. I don't know if any of you have read that. But is there a short that you feel has really kind of grabbed you? Could you give an example of one that really grabbed you, stayed with you for days or weeks afterwards, potentially?
Yeah. For me, it was Alyssa Wong's You'll Surely Drown Here If You Stay. It's probably the most, for lack of a better word, it's probably the most haunting short story I've ever read. And it's stuck with me for 3 years now. It's always in my head. When I sit down to write, it's always in my head. It's just this beautiful piece, and it's bittersweet, and it's brilliant.
That's good. Joyce?
I'm thinking.
I know you've mentioned several, and I'm putting you on the spot now and saying pick one.
Oh, well, I mean, the problem is recalling the titles, and because the ones that are, I think probably, and again, this is Zena Henderson, there's a couple of her people stories, and one of them is the story of what was it? Gilead, I think is what the title is. And it's about a brother and sister who are of the people, but they have gone through a lot. And when they are finally found by the people, Bethy is, jumps right into it because she's suffered. She's emphatic. She's home. Peter, on the other hand, is a little bit tougher, and he's kind of going, I don't know about this. But there's also another one in that pilgrimage book where there's a teacher dealing with that Fancher kid, who's kind of that kind of kid, if you're ever a teacher, who's scruffy, difficult, but you fall in love with what you see happening with that kid because they're growing and evolving. And that one has always haunted me.
Brilliant. I'm conscious now of time. I've realized that we've got a bit carried away here with those ones. So Patrick, can you just name name your story.
I'm having a tough time coming up with one. I love Mark Twain's shorts. I loved this one, journalism in, I want to say Arkansas, where he writes about taking a job as a journalist out in a rural area to get away from the bustle of the city, and he winds up walking into feuds and gunfights and everything. And it's just a funny parody kind of
Brilliant.
thing. But
No, that's good. I am going to have to make sure that we say goodbye. I'm sorry, otherwise we're going to get cut off. So thank you all so much for your time, and thank you to everyone at QuaranCon for putting it together. And make sure you visit Artist Alley as well. Thank you all very, very much.
Thanks.
Thank you all.